The coffee had gone cold hours ago. It sat forgotten beside Jules Mercer's chair, as bitter and stale as the silence clinging to the family's formal dining room. Crystal glasses shimmered, silverware glinted, but none of it masked the heavy judgment that had filled the air long before the guests arrived. His father stood at the head of the table, jaw clenched, eyes narrowed. "Your work," he said slowly, his voice slicing through the polite tension, "is filthy. Filthy like the lifestyle you chose, parading around as some wildlife photographer, a gay man chasing animals instead of a career." No one spoke, not his mother, who stared into her lap as if the china patterns might offer her escape. Not his sister Elizabeth, who let a crooked smile crawl across her lips. Jules looked around, hoping foolishly for someone to defend him. But there was only stillness, only shame burning beneath his skin. He stood, quietly, taking his camera bag from the floor like it was all he had left to carry. No one stopped him. No one even moved. Outside, the air was sharp. His car was parked alone under the yellow glow of the street lamp. Vermont license plate still new. That night, Jules drove north. He didn't cry. He'd done that too many times already in bedrooms behind locked doors, after school hallways where he'd been called freak, in silent prayers when his father refused to touch the photos he proudly printed. This wasn't new, but it was the last time he'd ever asked them to see him. He found shelter in a tiny studio near a forest preserve in Vermont, where the nights were cold, the stars uninterrupted, and no one looked twice when he said he lived alone. The room smelled of chemicals and wet negatives. A dark room, a bed, and a space just big enough to be his without apology. But silence has a memory. Even when the world around him was quiet, the voices followed. The echoes of Elizabeth calling him unnatural during childhood fights. His father's disgust when he caught Jules sketching a male ballet dancer in high school. The way his mother always seemed to leave the room right before someone said something cruel. Still, Jules held on, not to hope for them, but to the art that had always given him a way out. As a boy, he used to sneak out to photograph birds nesting behind the barn, building tiny worlds from the images he captured. As a man, he let that lens become his armor. And yet, even behind the strength he now wore the stubble, the steady hands, the quiet confidence in his gait, there lingered a truth few could see. He had not left because he was weak. He left because he had learned what it meant to stop begging for belonging. He stopped sending birthday cards. He stopped checking his phone every Thanksgiving. He stopped wondering if his father would ever say he was proud. Vermont didn't fix the hurt, but it gave him space to breathe, space to rebuild without the weight of proving anything. Because when a family teaches you you're broken, survival becomes an act of art, and that's exactly what Jules created, an artful, intentional, fiercely tender existence, where self-worth didn't have to be approved by blood. If this story pulled at something in you, something you've carried alone, follow Heartstorie. Because here, we believe healing isn't weakness. It's the bravest thing we do. In Vermont, the days came slowly, wrapped in the muted colors of pine forests and snow-dusted fields. Jules Mercer found comfort in the predictability of solitude. No one there knew his last name. No one asked about his past. That quiet anonymity became a blessing not because he wanted to forget, but because he needed space to become someone his family never imagined he could be. He started small, volunteering at a local wildlife rescue center, photographing injured owls, limping foxes, and sometimes animals that never made it through the night. He learned how to stay still for hours, waiting for a single moment, the blink of a deer, the arch of a hawk's wing, the exact second a fawn dared to look back. At first, his work lived in a folder on his computer, unseen by anyone but himself. But one day, after pulling a young doe from a poacher's wire snare, the animal shaking, wide-eyed and bleeding, Jules posted the story online with a simple caption, "Not every rescue leaves a scar." That video went viral. People weren't just moved by the image, but by the quiet strength behind the lens. Comments poured in, not about who he loved, but how he saw the world. Sponsors reached out. A well-known conservation brand offered to fund his next expedition. Photographers invited him to speak on panels. He was offered workshops, exhibitions, even a chance to license his photos to nature magazines. Still, Jules kept his pace deliberate. He didn't dress the part of a rising star. He wore the same flannel shirts, lived in the same narrow studio, edited photos by hand in his makeshift darkroom. His YouTube channel, Untamed Light, remained quiet and personal, a soft rebellion against the noise of the internet. He posted when he had something to say, not something to prove. And then came the lion. She wasn't his, not really. She belonged to a sanctuary out west. But Jules was there on assignment, shadowing the animals for a week. On the third evening, as the sun slipped below the ridge and lit the dust in golden waves, he captured her mid-leap, body stretched, eyes locked ahead, framed perfectly in the descending light. He didn't know then that the shot would change his life. A few months later, National Geographic contacted him. They wanted to purchase the image for the cover of their Winter Wildlife edition. When the issue hit shelves, his name was printed in fine white serif photography by Jules Mercer. He didn't tell his family. He returned home once for Thanksgiving. Not because he missed them, but because he wondered, just maybe, if they had changed. The house smelled the same: turkey, cinnamon, lemon soap. Elizabeth talked about her real estate license. His mother set the table like always, fork tines lined up with precision. No one asked what he'd been up to. His father spent dinner arguing politics with a cousin Jules barely remembered. The only time anyone acknowledged him was when Elizabeth rolled her eyes and joked, "Still playing in the woods, Jules." He smiled and said nothing. On the drive back, snow began to fall. He pulled over once, stepped out of the car, and let the flakes melt into his face. The road was empty. The world was quiet. And for the first time, he felt it: not anger, not sorrow, but release. He no longer needed their applause to feel whole. Recognition had found him in the wild, not in a dining room full of polished silver. He had earned respect from strangers by showing up for creatures that had no voice, a kind of work his family would never understand, because they had never learned to see beauty in what they didn't control. Sometimes, growth happens not despite the absence of support, but because of it. Jules didn't become successful to prove them wrong. He became himself because, finally, no one was trying to shape him into someone else. It was a cream-colored envelope, hand-delivered, not a phone call, not an email. The handwriting on the front was familiar, his mother's. Inside, a short note: "We'd love to see you. Elizabeth has exciting news. Saturday at noon. Come home." There was no apology, no explanation, just a formal invitation, as though the past hadn't burned a permanent scar across the walls of that house. Jules hesitated. For weeks. The note sat untouched on the corner of his workbench, weighed down by a paperweight shaped like a mountain goat. He told himself not to go, but something old and stubborn, some remaining thread of that child who used to draw animals in secret under the staircase, made him fold his best shirt and print his lion photo, framed, large, centered with a brass plate that read, "Cover, National Geographic." He arrived on time. The house looked exactly as he remembered it, only smaller now. The landscaping had been trimmed back, and the shutters needed paint. Inside, everything smelled of candles and roast beef. Elizabeth greeted him without a hug. "Still into pictures?" she asked, flicking her eyes at the framed photo tucked under his arm. Jules nodded, saying nothing. The living room was filled with familiar faces, extended family, neighbors, old friends from church. His father stood near the fireplace, drink in hand, recounting some anecdote about business taxes. Jules waited, unsure what this gathering was really about. It wasn't long before his father cleared his throat and tapped a spoon against his glass. "We're here to celebrate Elizabeth," he announced. "She's finally ready to launch her real estate firm, and we've made the decision to allocate the family's inheritance fund to support her dream." Applause. Cheers. Jules blinked. The photo in his hand suddenly felt heavier. He stepped forward gently and placed the frame on the mantel. "I thought I'd bring something too," he said, trying to steady his voice. "This was published last month." His father didn't even look. "We're not here for that," he replied. "Chasing animals and living like a wandering whatever you are. That's not a future. It's not a career. It's not a life." Jules felt the room shrink. He looked at his mother. She looked away. Elizabeth smiled, sipping wine. That night, he didn't wait for dessert. He picked up his coat, left the framed photograph exactly where it stood, and walked out. He drove back to Vermont in silence. The road was darker this time, the mountains taller. He didn't cry, but something closed permanently inside him. A door that had always been cracked open, waiting for light. It shut. In the days that followed, Jules didn't mention what had happened. Not to friends, not to the students in his upcoming workshop, not even to his own audience online. He returned to the forest. He photographed a snow fox curled in the roots of a cedar. He taught a young couple how to develop their first black and white prints. He watched a bear stir from hibernation beneath the glassy hush of morning, and slowly, something strange happened. He stopped needing to tell his story, not because it didn't matter, but because it no longer owned him. Rejection, when repeated often enough, can convince a person that they are small. But Jules had learned that even the smallest animals leave deep tracks in snow. He had spent his whole life asking for space at a table that never had a chair for him. Now, he was building a table of his own, and though it stood alone in a quiet cabin in the woods, it held more meaning than every chandelier-lit dinner he had ever sat through. Sometimes, the most painful silence is the one that follows your voice being dismissed. But even then, especially then, it's worth speaking. Because respect doesn't always come from where you hope, but dignity. That's something you build from within. The call came just after dawn. Jules had been up all night, editing photos from a winter shoot, an elk in the mist, framed by frost-covered evergreens. His phone vibrated against the windowsill, screen lit with a name he hadn't seen in months. Dad. He let it ring. Twice, then silence, then again. On the third attempt, curiosity won over instinct. Elizabeth's in trouble, his father said, voice thin, as if forced through clenched teeth. Her business is collapsing. She needs money. Jules didn't respond. His father continued. We've done all we can. We're asking for your help. 100,000, alone. Alone, and not an apology, not a question about his well-being, just a number. A request framed as if family was a contract that could be reactivated whenever convenient. I can't help you, Jules said simply, then ended the call. But they didn't stop. Within the week, they showed up. Not just a phone call this time, but in person. His father, his mother, even Elizabeth, standing awkwardly in the falling snow outside his studio, shivering in her tailored coat. Jules watched them through the frosted glass of his front door, heart heavy but unmoved. They came with tears, with words about blood and forgiveness and starting over. They said things like family sticks together and this isn't about the past. But it was everything they had once denied him: his identity, his work, his very dignity was now overshadowed by their need. The same people who had mocked his lifestyle, who had dismissed his achievements, now stood on his porch asking to benefit from the life they never wanted to understand. And then came the worst part. Elizabeth went online. She spun a story, half-truths and lies, framing Jules as heartless, selfish, a traitor to his own blood. She claimed he refused to help their family during a crisis. Her words spread like oil in water. His inbox flooded with hate. Sponsors pulled out, clients canceled. His next workshop, one he had spent months planning, was abandoned overnight. Jules didn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the ticking of the darkroom timer echo in the silence. All those years of work earned not with charm or wealth, but patience, resilience, and trust had been fractured by one viral post, but he refused to disappear. He gathered evidence. Screenshots, emails, records. He contacted a lawyer, not for revenge, but for truth. The courtroom wasn't dramatic. There were no gasps or slamming gavels, just facts, calmly laid out. Elizabeth's accusations were proven false. The judge ruled in Jules' favor: defamation, intentional economic harm, emotional distress. She was ordered to issue a public apology and pay damages. But it wasn't about the money. It never had been. Jules read the apology once, then deleted it. He didn't share it. He didn't celebrate. Instead, he walked into the woods that night with his camera, followed a fox until he lost track of time, and came back only when the stars were thick above the trees. Later, alone in the quiet warmth of his studio, Jules reopened the letter his mother had mailed months earlier. He hadn't read past the first line. This time, he did. Your father's still angry. Elizabeth moved back in. The house is so quiet now it feels like a graveyard. He folded the letter and placed it gently in a drawer. Not out of bitterness, but because he understood. Some people confuse proximity with love. They believe showing up after the storm is the same as weathering it with you. But love, the kind that heals, doesn't wait until it's convenient. What Jules had learned, painfully and clearly, was this: protecting your peace sometimes means disappointing people who were never truly rooting for your happiness. Forgiveness is not the same as reunion, and loyalty should never cost you your self-respect. The first snowfall of the season came quietly. Jules Mercer stood by his cabin window, watching the flakes settle on the branches like secrets too delicate to speak aloud. He had just returned from a photography trek near Lake Willoughby, his boots still damp, his fingers red from the cold. He hadn't planned to open the mailbox that day, but something nudged him toward the wooden box nailed to the pine post by the road. Inside, among catalogs and envelopes, was a letter in a familiar hand, his mother's. He read it at the kitchen table. No fanfare, no dramatics, just a single sheet folded once. Your father's still angry. Elizabeth moved back in. The house is so quiet now it feels like a graveyard. No apology, no mention of the court case, just silence dressed as an update. Jules folded the letter neatly and slid it into the drawer beneath his desk. It wasn't bitterness that made him leave it there. It was peace. He had nothing more to prove, no explanations left to give. That part of his life, loud with rejection and quieter still with denial, had finally gone still. He spent the following days working alone in his darkroom, developing film from a recent shoot in the Adirondacks. The room filled with soft orange light, chemical scents, and the slow birth of images on paper: wolves, bare trees, the glint of an owl's eyes at dusk. Here, everything made sense. In the wilderness, things either thrived or didn't. There was no pretending, no performance. One afternoon, a small envelope arrived without a return address. Inside was a letter, handwritten, shaking slightly in its curves. The name at the bottom made Jules pause. Marcus, one of his former workshop students. He remembered him nervous, quiet, always lingering after class like he had something more to say, but never did. I watched your videos when I didn't want to be here anymore. The way you spoke, the way you moved through forests without apology. I started to believe there might be a place for someone like me. I never told anyone I was gay, but I'm telling you, you saved me, even if you didn't know it. Jules set the letter down slowly, eyes fixed on the trembling ink. That night, he sat by the fireplace, snow piling high outside, and for the first time in years, he felt something shift. Not closure, not triumph. Just a soft, undeniable truth. Family isn't always built from the people who raise you. Sometimes it's built from the people who see you, who stay, who thank you simply for being. He hadn't gone into the woods looking to save anyone. He just wanted to find himself in the silence. But somehow, that search became a lifeline for others. The next morning, Jules returned to the forest with his camera slung over his shoulder, not to escape, not to hide, but because the world, in its rawest places, had always met him without judgment. He paused beneath an open clearing, exhaled into the cold, and looked out across the snow-covered trees. The shutter clicked once. Then again, he didn't need recognition. Not anymore. Because the most powerful validation is the kind you give yourself when no one's watching. And as he stood there, lens pointed toward a horizon that asked nothing of him, he realized he had finally stopped waiting for his family to love him the way he deserved, because he already knew how to love himself. Now tell me, have you ever had to choose peace over people you once called family? And if you did, was it worth it? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to follow Heartstorie for more powerful journeys like this one, because sometimes the hardest stories to hear are the ones that heal us most.